Welcome to the Advanced Cubicles and Compromises Build Your Own Company walkthrough. My name is Ian Meyer. So first, let's talk about what a tabletop exercise is. A tabletop exercise helps companies prepare to react to incidents. Often, these exercises are required under specific regulatory or compliance standards. Tabletop exercises help prepare teams that don't often work together to interact under high-stress situations. Executives, legal, external communications, legal engineers, security, etc. It helps test your incident response plan, and it evaluates the reactions of the incident response team against likely scenarios. So what is Advanced Cubicles and Compromises? Well, a few years ago, John Strand and the Black Hills team put together Cubicles and Compromises, which was a dice-based game that introduced some randomness to your response. You think you have a control, you believe it works, but what happens when it doesn't? Advanced Cubicles and Compromises takes that a bit further and expands the format by adding injects outside of security, as well as additional modifiers that impact incident response. The injects are new information or outcomes the response team has to address. This is an important concept. Anytime you're dealing with an emergency or any sort of incident, no matter what it is, there's always information that you wished you had known. An inject is something that comes up during the exercise that gives you more clarity or a new problem to solve. In our exercises, this tabletop format will have plenty of those injects. So the tabletop format here can be played as a workshop with multiple companies using their incident response plan, or using a fake company created for the game. This presentation will help you create that company using your player's guide and your company creation worksheet. The latter option, the creating the fake company, is designed to be fun and educational without potentially sharing incident response plans with large groups. So now let's talk about building your company. So the company that you're going to build for this exercise isn't your company or where you work. It's one that you've made up, and you have a certain set of parameters. You are the newly selected CISO at a company that's operated in stealth startup mode. They just got a major funding round. They have minimal viable product. Basically, that's the very minimum you need to sell something that investors will invest in. They need to build a security program so they can sell the product and maybe even the company. Things to keep in mind. This company has very few, if any, controls. They have a budget of about $2 million for you to use deploying controls within the environment. You can't deploy everything you want at the same time. This is true in the game, and this is true in real life. You will only have a limited number of resources and hours in the day. Sure, could you hire 1,000 people to type out Shakespeare? Absolutely. Same thing with security controls. You can only deploy so much change at one time without truly impacting the company. So you have to choose. You also don't want to spend all of your money. Things happen. During the game, injects will occur that will cause you to have to spend money to recover. As well, your controls could fail, meaning that you're going to have to spend money to recover from those failures. Now, don't worry if you're at the workshop or you're an online attendee or you haven't had time to build a company. No problem. We've built 5 company sheets you can choose from by clicking on the link in the presentation. There's a couple different scenarios. The first is, we spent most of the budget. People got $2 million and went a little nutty, leaving you not a whole lot to deal with situations as they come up. You've also got a scenario where we deployed what the auditors told us to deploy. In this scenario, the company is just deploying what they think the auditors want. It might not be what they need, and it might not even make any rational sense, but they were told to deploy it, so they did. We deployed the minimum. The very minimum money could buy. All they did was buy a few things to try and check a few boxes. We bought what was cheapest. They looked through everything they could buy and said, what's the least amount of money we can spend? And have something in each of these categories. And then, of course, YOLO, we just picked random stuff. So in this scenario, you've picked a few random things. Hopefully they'll protect you. Is it better than nothing? Sure, probably. Could it be exactly what you need in the specific incident? Maybe. Is it? Who knows? We'd have to see. So let's talk about budget. You will be given a budget to deploy controls to protect your company. Each control has a specific cost and will grant you a specific modifier to roll your inject. Now, here's the thing. During each inject, you will have to roll dice. We'll talk about this during the workshop. These dice will determine how effective your control was. So, higher priced controls have more value and are more difficult to deploy, but they may give you more protection. Cost doesn't always directly relate to the value, specifically the modifiers. We'll talk about that in a moment. And you shouldn't spend all of your budget before the game starts. Business will happen, and it will generally cost you money. So remember, do not overspend. As you can see, there are plenty of opportunities for unexpected costs to appear. Just like running a real business with a security team, make sure you leave some money in reserve to address issues. So let's talk about these controls, these things that I keep mentioning. Controls are tied in this game to the NIST cybersecurity framework, commonly referred to as the CSF. Controls were selected from each category: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. These are categories inside of the NIST CSF that help define different controls that you may need. Now, in your company creation worksheet, which we'll look at in a moment, you'll have areas for each one of these categories. So, as I mentioned, you can't deploy everything that you want at the same time. In this scenario, you can choose no more than 5 controls from each category. You must select at least one control from each category. You can't just load everything up in identify or protect and hope everything is okay. You need to try and choose a mixture of controls. Your player's guide has a listing of technical controls, things like firewalls and IPS/IDS systems. It also has administrative policies. It even has things like executive support, just having an executive team that understands what you need and supports your decisions. You want to have a mixture of these things to help protect you from specific incidents. Controls come with modifiers to improve your success. We'll talk about that more a little later, but essentially it is this. Just like anything, the better you deploy it, the better it works. So, if you spend a certain amount of money deploying something to a base level and then improve it, the chances of it working successfully to defend you are much higher. So, you can also get improved through what's called deployment tiers. Let's talk about that now. This is what I was referring to earlier. The NIST CSF has a concept of deployment effectiveness. This is broken into tiers. These are partial, risk-informed, repetitive, and adaptive. They're almost exactly what you might get from the context. Partially deployed essentially means you've racked it and powered it on. It's doing something, but maybe not everything you need. Risk-informed, now you've deployed the control, you're beginning to understand it, and you're starting to apply it to the actual risk in your environment. Repeatable. Now the control is working as designed consistently. It's doing exactly what you expect and protecting from exactly what you would expect it to protect you from. Finally is adaptive. Adaptive now means the control is mature enough that it's able to change and grow with the environment and against threats. Tier 1 is 25% of the base control cost. Tier 2 is 50%. Tier 3, 75%, and Tier 4, 100%. I'm sure you could figure it out from there. So, to be partially deployed, meaning you've deployed the tool, plus you've done a little bit of work to it, making it partially deployed. It's not just in the rack consuming electrons. You would take the total cost of the control from your player's guide, subtract that from your total, and to get the additional modifier for your deployment, you would add 25% of the base cost. To get to risk-informed, Tier 2, 50%, Tier 3, 75%, Tier 4, 100%. You cannot jump to Tier 3 by paying 75% of the base control. A fully deployed control that costs $100,000 would have a total cost of ownership of $350,000 if it were deployed all the way to the adaptive tier. Basically, $100K plus $25K plus $50K plus $75K plus the full cost of $100K at the 4th level. However, it will add a +4 to any dice roll where that control would help mitigate against the inject. So, these are very important. We'll cover this during the workshop. It's just important to understand that as you add modifiers, you get greater levels of protection against specific issues inside of the incident. So now let's select controls. Here, we'll take your Advanced Cubicles and Compromises Company Creation Worksheet. You should have received a copy either in a digital format or as a paper copy in the workshop. You'll give your company a name, maybe put some fun details in about the made-up company, and start tracking your budget. Remember, you have $2 million. Note, as we talked about, there are the 5 NIST CSF categories. In each of those categories, you have 5 spaces to place controls. You'll find those controls in your player's guide. Once you purchase the control, subtract the amount from your starting budget, and then also if you choose to deploy with additional tiers, you'll subtract those amounts as well for each tier that you choose to deploy the control. So remember, $100,000 tier, first tier costs an additional $25,000, so $125,000 if you were to choose a control with a $100,000 base cost. You'll then write in your control in the appropriate section and take your modifier from the base control and write that next to it, remembering to take any additional control tiers that you've deployed and place them in the circles next to the actual control, filling them in for each deployment tier. This is a reminder as you roll, if you find that there is an incident that the incident master goes through and describes, saying that if you have this specific control, it can defend against this inject. You'll roll your dice and you'll be able to add a modifier plus 1 for each individual deployment tier. Don't worry, we're going to cover this in depth during the workshop. It's just important to understand the tiers and how you purchase them. Remember, you must have at least 1 control per category. Also remember, the tiers for deployment are 25, 50, and 75, and then finally 100% of the control costs. You must purchase each tier individually, and you can check your player's guide for specific detail about each control. We're just going to look at an overview of the controls now. So our first set of controls, the Identify controls, start on page 8 of the player's guide. These help companies understand and manage cyber risk. There are categories inside of here: asset management, business environment, governance, and risk management. I won't go through each of these because they're detailed inside of your player's guide, but you can see a theme where at this point what you're doing is assembling teams, tools, technologies to try and identify all the things that you need to protect in your environment and potentially detect when there are problems. You'll need these when you move into the next phase, which is the Protect. Now, the NIST CSF Protect controls start on page 10 of the player's guide. You'll develop and implement appropriate safeguards to ensure delivery of critical services. Categories here include identity management and access, awareness and training, data security, information protection processes, procedures, maintenance, and protective technology. Here is where you really start getting into technical controls. You'll note things like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, role-based access control, CASBs, a number of different technologies that will help you protect the environment from attackers. Now we move into page 12 on the player's guide for the Detect controls. These develop and implement appropriate activities to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event. So, categories here include anomalies and events, security continuous monitoring, and detection processes. Notice that now we're getting less controls. We have our security incident event managers, AV, log review, our security operations center. These are all areas that can detect a problem after they've occurred. Next, we have our Respond controls on page 13. Here, they develop and implement appropriate activities to take action regarding a detected cybersecurity incident. Categories here include response planning, communications, analysis, mitigation, and improvements. Notice here there's a lot of plans and processes. These are very, very important. You might be able to detect an incident. You might even be able to start to figure out what went wrong and what you need to do. But if you don't know how to respond to it, chances are that you're not going to get very far. We now have our Recover controls on page 14. These develop and implement appropriate activities to maintain plans for resilience and to restore any capabilities or services that were impaired due to a cybersecurity incident. Categories here are recovery planning, improvements, and communications. You'll notice here the social media team and other brand management teams. These are teams that aren't often thought of inside of an incident response plan, but are crucial to protecting the organization in the event there is an incident where you need to disclose to the public. Think about these controls during your incident response planning. That's it. That's how you build the company. Essentially, you go through, fill those in, get the pages filled in with the additional controls, and hopefully you'll have a company that's ready to withstand whatever incident you see in Advanced Cubicles and Compromises. So bring your company or a pre-built company to the workshop and get ready to work through the incident. Again, my name was Ian Meyer. I appreciate your time and look forward to working with you in the Advanced Cubicles and Compromises workshop.